All of the following delineate differences between the northern and southern states, except option A says the North pursues and preaches eco-friendly measures and offers help to the South in hurtling ahead on the economic bowling alley. Now, the analogy aside, hurtling ahead on the economic bowling alley, we find that this is not a point of difference because the North does pursue and preach an eco-friendly outlook, which we can see repeated in the passage. The first paragraph mentions this. The second paragraph mentions this here. Since the North expects environmentally good behavior concessions as diplomatic weapons and offers to help the South in hurtling ahead. So offers to help the South in moving ahead in terms of the economy. That is also true. We see that from the third paragraph. After the lost decade of the 1980s, in putting back the North-South division squarely on the international agenda, the spotlight was thus largely focused on the North's willingness to come up with the $125 billion of yearly assistance to fulfill its long overdue promise of allocating 0.7% of its GNP to development aid to provide clean technologies or access to bio-industrial patents. So yes, this is true that the North does pursue and preach eco-friendliness. It also offers to help the South in making economic development. But that said, this is not presented as a point of difference. We see that here, the aspect of the South is not mentioned. So this is actually a valid choice. Option B says, Northern states have historically taken a lead in environmental issues to undo damages they inflicted on the environment. The South uses it as a bargaining chip to gain aid. Now, this takes us back to the 1970s as such, in the 1980s, definitely. There is an aspect of the North not fulfilling its promises. Yes, sure. We see this particularly from the second paragraph. After the South's years of uneasiness in dealing with the environmental concerns raised by the North, the plot for Rio had finally thickened. Since the North expects environmentally good behavior concessions as diplomatic weapons, consequently, the South reiterated the unfulfilled demands of the 1970s and opposed them to North's ecological impositions. So we find first off that the South's years of uneasiness were in dealing with the environmental concerns raised by the North. And these were raised early on. So the northern states, they have taken a lead in environmental issues, especially a historical lead in environmental issues. That is definitely true. To undo damages they inflicted upon the environment, this is a little bit more fleeting. This is inferential from the passage, a little bit more fleeting. We see this particularly in the last statement. There are a few other passing references to this, but we see it here. Apart from all the economic pressures, adherence to development puts the South culturally and politically in a position of structural weakness, leading to the absurd situation in which the North can present itself as the benevolent provider of solutions to the ecological crisis. So we see that the ecological crisis is something that the northern states are not in favor of, they are not in favor of the crisis, but they are concerned with. So they are in favor of ecological preservation. And then again, northern states have taken measures to be the providers of solutions. Hence, they have taken a lead in environmental issues historically also, as we have seen from the beginning of the second paragraph. We can infer that to undo damages they inflicted, it is an ecological crisis. And there are these two blocks in the world. So it is basically of the making of these two blocks, these nations themselves, especially nations which put development, economic development or economic growth or economy above the environment. The South uses it as a bargaining chip to gain aid. This is also true. We can see this in particular, again, in the second paragraph. We've actually already seen the reference to this. Consequently, the South reiterated the unfulfilled demands of the 1970s and opposed them to the North's ecological impositions. We see that, let's clear this out. We see from the third paragraph that it is stated that the South actually emulates the Northern model. It is stated here, the South has, or rather, the South continues to subscribe to the notion that the North shows the way for the rest of the world. Also, make clear that the South has no intention of abandoning the Northern model of living as its implicit utopia. So the South uses the North as a bargaining chip. That is quite clear from these statements. There's another reference to this in the first paragraph. We can see that here it is not necessarily talking, it is not directly talking about the South, but it is talking about the North-South debate. We see here, after the UNCED, slogans which had animated the 1970s discussions on the new international economic order kept creeping back to the forefront. Suddenly, calls for the better terms of trade, debt relief, entry to northern markets, technology transfer, and aid, and more aid drowned the environmentalist discussion. So in all of this, we find that the South is actually trying to gain aid or gain support against the North taking an environmentally aware stance. We see one more reference here. While the northern countries' main concern was about nature, the South, in the wrap-up to the conference, managed to highlight the question of justice. In fact, during the debates leading to the UNCED, attentive spectators wondered if they had not seen it all before. So we find that this option is definitely something which delineates a difference between the North and the South. Hence, option B can be eliminated. Option C tells us the North prioritizes ecological preservation above everything else, while the South demands that such preservation be integrated into the need for economic growth. This we can see from the last few lines of the first paragraph and from the second paragraph. It is stated here, the South, deeply hurt by the breakdown of development illusions, launched demands for further rounds of development. This, in fact, also helps us qualify the previous option, at least this part of it. Already in the June 1991 Beijing Declaration of the Group of 77, the point was made clearly and bluntly. The point which is mentioned here as the point or the outlook of the South. Environmental problems cannot be dealt with separately. They must be linked to the development process, bringing the environmental concerns in line with the imperatives of economic growth and development. In this context, the right to development for the developing countries must be fully recognized. And then again, after the South's years of uneasiness in dealing with the environmental concerns raised by the North, so North prioritizes ecological preservation. It could be inferred above everything else because the North, as we've seen repeatedly in the passage, is economically strong, much stronger than the South. That we can see from the third paragraph, where there is a particular reference to this here in the split between the North's super economy and the South's wretched economies. So we have this aspect already established. And then we see that while the North prioritizes ecological preservation, the South demands that such preservation be integrated into the need for economic growth. Another reference to this is in the second paragraph. So since the North expects environmentally good behavior concessions as diplomatic weapons, consequently, the South reiterated the unfulfilled demands of the 1970s and opposed them to the North's ecological impositions. So the North's ecological impositions, the expectation of environmentally good behavior concessions, that is something that the South opposed by restating or reiterating the unfulfilled demands of the 1970s. So this overall can also be qualified as being a point of difference, a point on which the North and the South differ. with each other, in fact, have contradictory or contrary outlooks. So C is incorrect. Option D says the North insists upon compromises with protection of nature in mind, but the South opposes this expectation, citing past promises that have been reneged upon. Now, this is particularly a reference to the second paragraph. The environmental concerns raised by the North expects environmentally good behavior concessions as diplomatic weapons. So the North insists upon compromises with protection of nature in mind. Why compromises? Because we are talking about concessions here. Concessions and compromises are somewhat synonymous in this context, essentially synonymous. But the South opposes this, yes, oppose them to North's ecological impositions, citing past promises that have been reneged upon, where the South reiterated the unfulfilled demands of the 1970s. So this is a direct reference type point, clearly a point of difference between the North and the South. So D is incorrect. We can eliminate it. The correct answer is option A.